Mr. Chairman, I object to this witness testifying before this committee. Tulsi Gabbard is a Russian asset who abandoned the Democratic Party to serve authoritarian regimes. She met with the dictator Assad in Syria. She spreads Kremlin propaganda. She parrots talking points from Moscow. She has no business testifying before Congress on matters of national security or congressional ethics. She's a traitor to American values, and I move that she be removed from this hearing immediately. Those were Nancy Pelosi's words spoken on live television broadcast across every major network, aimed at destroying the credibility of a sitting director of national intelligence who also happened to be a decorated combat veteran. The 84-year-old former speaker, worth $200 million after 37 years in Congress, thought she could eliminate another critic with an accusation of treason. She thought her decades of political power made her untouchable. She thought questioning someone's patriotism would end the conversation. She was catastrophically wrong, because what Pelosi didn't know was that Lieutenant Colonel Tulsi Gabbard, combat veteran, Iraq War survivor, current Director of National Intelligence, had spent 3 months preparing for this moment. Every suspicious stock trade, every instance of unexplained wealth, every luxury purchase while Americans struggled, every hypocritical statement, all compiled into one devastating file. Pelosi's attack gave Gabbard the opening to unleash it all. Destroy that like button, because you're about to witness something unprecedented. A combat veteran with the combat medical badge systematically dismantling a career politician worth $250 million using nothing but documented evidence, military precision, and the moral authority of someone who actually served their country under fire. This isn't Democrat versus Republican. This is combat veteran versus career politician. Service versus self-enrichment. Honor versus hypocrisy. Youth versus age. A 43-year-old warrior who earned everything through sacrifice versus an 84-year-old dynasty politician who inherited power and accumulated wealth. Nancy Pelosi tried to destroy Tulsi Gabbard's reputation. Instead, she just gave a lieutenant colonel with access to classified intelligence the microphone to expose everything. The hearing room of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence was charged with tension even before the session began. This wasn't routine congressional business. This was political theater at its highest stakes, and everyone in the packed chamber knew it. At 10:00 a.m. on a Thursday morning in Washington, D.C., the room buzzed with anticipation. Journalists from every major outlet occupied the press gallery. Congressional staffers filled the back rows. Security personnel stood at strategic positions. The C-SPAN cameras captured every angle, while cable news networks interrupted regular programming for live coverage. The hearing's official title was National Security Threats and Congressional Ethics in the Modern Era. But everyone understood the real agenda. This was about Tulsi Gabbard, former Democratic Congresswoman turned Republican current Director of National Intelligence, combat veteran, and one of the most controversial political figures in America. At the witness table sat Lieutenant Colonel Tulsi Gabbard in a dark navy suit, an American flag pin on her lapel. At 43 years old, she carried herself with the bearing of someone who'd served in combat zones, straight posture, calm expression, alert eyes that missed nothing. Her shoulder-length dark hair was pulled back professionally. No excessive jewelry, no designer labels the understated appearance of someone who'd spent years in military uniform where appearance regulations were strict. Chairman Mike Turner, the Republican from Ohio, gavelled the hearing to order at 10:03 a.m. The committee will come to order. Today we examine issues at the intersection of national security and ethical conduct in government service. Our first witness is Director Tulsi Gabbard, currently serving as Director of National Intelligence. Director Gabbard also served with distinction in the United States Army, deploying twice to the Middle East and represented Hawaii's 2nd Congressional District from 2013 to 2021. Director Gabbard, you're recognized for your opening statement. Gabbard leaned toward the microphone, her voice clear and measured. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. Before I begin, I want to establish my credentials for this discussion because I believe experience matters when we discuss national security and ethics. She paused, making eye contact with committee members. I am a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Reserve. I enlisted in the Hawaii Army National Guard in 2003, shortly after the attacks of September 11, 2001. In 2004, I volunteered to deploy to Iraq with my unit, becoming the first state official to voluntarily step down from public office to serve in a war zone. I served with a field medical unit at Logistical Support Area Anaconda in Iraq from 2004 to 2005. I was awarded the Combat Medical Badge for participation in combat operations under enemy hostile fire. That's not a medal you get for sitting in an office. You earn it by serving in combat under fire while the enemy is trying to kill you. The room was silent. Every person focused on her words. In 2007, I graduated as the Distinguished Honor Graduate from the Alabama Military Academy's Accelerated Officer Candidate School, the first woman in the Academy's 50-year history to achieve that distinction. I deployed again to Kuwait from 2008 to 2009, serving as a military police platoon leader. I was the first woman to enter a Kuwaiti military facility and the first woman awarded by the Kuwait National Guard for training their counterterrorism teams. Gabbard's voice carried the weight of experience. I've served for over 2 decades in uniform. I've led soldiers in combat zones. I've made decisions where lives were at stake. I currently serve as Director of National Intelligence, overseeing 18 intelligence agencies with a combined budget of over $80 billion and more than 100,000 personnel. I was confirmed by the United States Senate 53 to 47 after extensive FBI background checks, security clearance reviews, and testimony. She looked directly at the cameras. I say this not to boast, but to establish that my commitment to this nation has been proven through service, through sacrifice, and through the willingness to put my life on the line. Now, regarding the intersection of national security and congressional ethics. The doors at the back of the chamber opened with more force than necessary. Nancy Pelosi entered, and the effect was immediate and calculated. At 84 years old, the former Speaker of the House still knew how to command a room. She wore a deep purple suit with a statement necklace, her silver hair styled with precision. Every camera in the room pivoted. Journalists sat up straighter. Even committee members turned to watch. Pelosi walked down the center aisle with deliberate slowness, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She didn't acknowledge the disruption her late arrival caused. She didn't hurry. This was her show, or so she believed. After 37 years in Congress, including 4 years as the first female Speaker of the House, she'd perfected the art of political theater. She took a seat 3 positions down from Ranking Member Jim Himes in a spot that would keep her prominently in frame for the cameras. She arranged papers before her with practiced movements, adjusted her microphone, then leaned to whisper something to the congressman beside her. A slight smile played at her lips. Gabbard, demonstrating the discipline learned from years of military service, continued her testimony without missing a beat. As I was saying, the intersection of national security and ethics is particularly relevant When we consider that members of Congress receive classified briefings on matters of national defense intelligence operations and point of order, Mr. Chairman. Pelosi's voice cut through the room with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling congressional proceedings. Chairman Turner looked up, clearly surprised. The gentle lady from California is recognized. Pelosi adjusted her microphone, then fixed her gaze not on the chairman, but directly across the room at Tulsi Gabbard. When she spoke, her voice carried both dismissiveness and contempt, the tone of someone who believed she was about to deliver a fatal political blow. Mr. Chairman, I object to this witness testifying before this committee. Tulsi Gabbard is a Russian asset who abandoned the Democratic Party to serve authoritarian regimes. She met with the dictator Assad in Syria while American troops were fighting and dying. She spreads Kremlin propaganda about the war in Ukraine. She parrots talking points straight from Moscow. She has no business testifying before Congress on matters of national security or congressional ethics. The room erupted. Republican members began objecting simultaneously, their voices overlapping in protest. Democrats shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some nodding in agreement with Pelosi, others looking uncertain, recognizing that attacking a combat veteran's patriotism was dangerous political territory. The press gallery exploded with activity, journalists typing frantically, photographers' cameras clicking rapidly. But Pelosi wasn't finished. She leaned further into her microphone, her voice rising slightly with theatrical indignation. This woman abandoned her party, abandoned her principles, and now serves an administration that coddles dictators and undermines American interests. She's a traitor to American values, and I move that she be removed from this hearing immediately. The word traitor hung in the air like a bomb. It was a nuclear option in political discourse, questioning not just someone's policies or judgment, but their fundamental loyalty to the nation. Several Republican members rose from their seats in protest. Chairman Turner's gavel came down repeatedly, trying to restore order. Through it all, Tulsi Gabbard sat perfectly still at the witness table. No anger flushed her face. No defensive posture tensed her shoulders. She simply watched Pelosi with the calm, analytical expression of someone who'd been in far more dangerous situations than a congressional hearing. For exactly 10 seconds, long enough for every camera to zoom in for the moment, to crystallize in thousands of viewers' minds, Gabbard displayed the slight smile of someone watching an opponent walk directly into a carefully prepared trap. The room gradually quieted, the outrage settling into an electric anticipation. Everyone sensed they were about to witness something significant. Chairman Turner looked uncertain about how to proceed. Ranking Member Himes appeared to be considering whether to support Pelosi's motion. Other committee members watched with the wariness of people who sensed they were in the blast radius of something explosive. Tulsi Gabbard took a slow sip of water from the glass before her, set it down with deliberate precision. Then she spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying clearly throughout the chamber with unmistakable authority. Madam Speaker, she began, using Pelosi's former title with pointed respect. Thank you for sharing your concerns about my credibility and loyalty to this nation. Let me address them directly. She remained seated, projecting calm rather than defensiveness. You called me a Russian asset and a traitor. Those are serious accusations. In my position as Director of National Intelligence, such accusations, if they were true, would constitute one of the greatest security breaches in American history. So let me ask you a question. Madam Speaker, if I were actually a Russian asset, as you publicly claim on national television, would the Federal Bureau of Investigation have cleared me for security access? Would the Central Intelligence Agency, Would the Defense Intelligence Agency? Pelosi opened her mouth to interrupt, but Gabbard continued, her voice firm. Would the United States Senate, after extensive hearings, after reviewing my entire background, after testimony from intelligence professionals, have confirmed me as Director of National Intelligence by a vote of 53 to 47? Do you believe our entire intelligence community, our FBI, our Senate, are all compromised? Or is it possible that your accusation is politically motivated and has no basis in fact? She paused, letting that sink in. I served in Iraq, Madam Speaker. I was there, on the ground, under enemy fire. I earned the Combat Medical Badge in combat operations. That's not a political position or a policy disagreement. That's serving your country while people are trying to kill you. Have you ever served in uniform? Have you ever deployed to a combat zone? Have you ever put your life on the line for this nation? The questions landed like artillery rounds. Several committee members sat forward in their chairs. But since you've questioned my security clearance, my ethics, and my loyalty to this country on national television, Gabbard said, reaching down beside her chair, let me respond by examining yours. Her hand emerged holding a folder, not a thin manila folder, but a massive, overstuffed accordion folder, easily 4 inches thick, bulging with documents. Multiple colored tabs marking different sections, protruding from its edges. It landed on the table before her with a solid thump that echoed through the silent chamber. Every eye in the room fixed on that folder. Every camera zoomed in. The visual was perfect physical, undeniable evidence of preparation of documentation of a case, built with the same methodical approach that Gabbard had used planning military operations. Madam Speaker, Gabbard said, her voice taking on the measured tone of a military officer delivering a briefing. Since you've questioned my credibility and my ethics, I believe it's appropriate to examine yours. Specifically, I'd like to discuss how you've accumulated a personal net worth of $264 million on a congressional salary of $223,500 per year. She opened the folder, revealing hundreds of pages of documents, printouts, highlighted sections, sticky notes marking key passages. I'd like to discuss why your husband, Paul Pelosi, sold over $500,000 worth of Visa stock in July 2024, just 2 months before the Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against Visa that caused the stock to drop 5%. I'd like to discuss why he purchased over $1 million in NVIDIA call options in June and July of 2022, right before Congress voted on the CHIPS and Science Act that would provide $42 billion in subsidies to semiconductor companies like NVIDIA. Gabbard's eyes remained fixed on Pelosi as she continued. I'd like to discuss your real estate portfolio worth over $50 million, your Pacific Heights mansion, your Napa Valley vineyard, where you throw lavish parties for wealthy donors, your Georgetown condominium. I'd like to discuss how you accumulated all of that on a government salary. She paused for effect. You called me a Russian asset, Madam Speaker. You questioned my loyalty to America. But I have a question for you. Are your actions trading stocks based on information you receive in classified congressional briefings, accumulating vast wealth while in public office, living in extraordinary luxury, while lecturing Americans about inequality? Are those the actions of someone serving their country or someone serving themselves? The silence in the chamber was absolute, except for the soft whir of cameras and the furious typing of journalists. Nancy Pelosi sat rigid in her seat, the confident expression she'd worn when attacking Gabbard completely evaporated, replaced by something between shock and calculation, the look of someone who'd badly miscalculated and was scrambling to assess the damage. Chairman Turner, recognizing that something extraordinary was unfolding before him, made a decision. The witness was directly attacked by the gentle lady from California regarding her credibility, her ethics, and her loyalty to the nation. She has the right to respond to those attacks. Director Gabbard, you may proceed. Tulsi Gabbard's slight smile returned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the American people deserve to hear some facts about how their elected representatives accumulate wealth while in office. Let's start with what I call the $264 million question. Tulsi Gabbard arranged a series of documents across the witness table in chronological order, each one bearing official government seals, financial institution, letterheads, or public disclosure stamps. The cameras captured the methodical organization. This wasn't a hasty political attack, but a prepared investigation. Madam Speaker, Gabbard began, her voice taking on the analytical tone of an intelligence briefing. In my role as Director of National Intelligence, I oversee investigations into potential threats to national security. One of the red flags we look for is unexplained wealth, when someone has access to classified information and simultaneously accumulates wealth that cannot be justified by their documented income sources. She held up a document. This concept isn't partisan or political. It's basic counterintelligence. Unexplained wealth suggests potential compromise, that someone might be selling secrets, taking bribes, or using classified information for personal gain. So when I see a pattern of wealth accumulation that doesn't match documented income, my training tells me to investigate further. Gabbard pulled out a chart she'd created showing Pelosi's reported net worth over time. Let me show you why your financial situation raises red flags that would concern any counterintelligence professional. According to Open Secrets, which compiles data from mandatory congressional financial disclosures, your net worth in 2009 was approximately $58 million. Already substantial, you were one of the wealthiest members of Congress. She pointed to the first data point on her chart. By 2014, just 5 years later, your net worth had nearly doubled to $101 million. Another point on the chart. By 2018, it reached $114 million. By 2021, $120 million. And according to the most recent analysis from multiple sources cross-referencing your financial disclosures, as of 2024, your net worth stands at approximately $264 million. Gabbard set down the chart so the cameras could capture it clearly. Let's do the mathematics, Madam Speaker. In 2009, you were worth $58 million. Today, you're worth $264 million. That's an increase of $206 million over 15 years. She pulled out a calculator, making a show of entering the numbers. You've served in Congress for 37 years. Your current salary is $223,500 per year. When you were Speaker, you earned $223,500. Before leadership positions, you earned the standard congressional salary. Over your entire career, your total congressional compensation before taxes is approximately $8.3 million. She looked up at Pelosi. That's $8.3 million in total salary over 37 years. Yet you're worth $264 million. That's a discrepancy of $255.7 million. Where did that money come from? The question hung in the chamber. Several committee members leaned forward, clearly interested in the answer despite their party affiliations. Now I know what you're going to say, Gabbard continued, that it came from investments, that your husband, Paul Pelosi, is a successful investor who made smart decisions. Let's examine that claim. But first, let me show you something else that raises questions. She pulled out property records, tax assessor documents, public filings. You and your husband own an extensive real estate portfolio currently valued at approximately $45 to $50 million. Let me detail these holdings because each one tells a story about wealth accumulation. Gabbard displayed a photograph taken from public records showing a stately red brick mansion. Pacific Heights, San Francisco. This property was purchased in 2007 for $2.25 million. It's registered to the Paul Pelosi Family Trust. According to San Francisco property records and your own financial disclosures, this property is now valued between $10 and $20 million. This is a 332 square foot mansion built in 1938 in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in America, Gabbard noted. Beautiful home, but on a congressional salary. She moved to the next photograph, an aerial view of a sprawling vineyard estate. Napa Valley Vineyard and Residence, purchased in 1990 for $2.35 million. According to your disclosures, it's worth at least $5 million today, though real estate experts suggest significantly more given the property's size and location. This property is particularly interesting, Gabbard said, looking at the details. It's 1655 acres, includes a 314 square foot main house, plus a 2400 square foot addition added in 2006, tennis court, swimming pool. Your financial disclosures note it generates at least $1,000 per year in grape sales. Local residents report that when you're in residence, you host lavish parties for donors and political allies with, and I'm quoting a neighbor here, gaggles of black SUVs and increased air traffic. No missing when Speaker Pelosi comes to town. She displayed more documents. You also own a condominium in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., one of the capital's most exclusive neighborhoods just 15 minutes from the Capitol, and 2 commercial buildings in San Francisco, each valued in your disclosures at between $5 and $25 million, generating between $15,000 and $50,000 per year in rental income. Gabbard stepped back from the documents, surveying them. That's approximately $50 million in real estate holdings. Now, Madam Speaker, your total congressional salary over 37 years before taxes and before any living expenses is $8.3 million. Yet you own $50 million worth of property. That's 6 times your entire career salary just in real estate. Before we even discuss the other $214 million of your net worth. She looked directly at Pelosi. So my first question, as someone trained to identify security concerns, how did you purchase $50 million worth of real estate on a government salary that wouldn't pay for even one of these properties? Pelosi leaned toward her microphone, her voice defensive. My husband is a successful businessman who— Yes, let's discuss your husband, Gabbard interrupted smoothly, pulling out a new stack of documents. Paul Pelosi, owner of Financial Leasing Services, Inc., a venture capital and financial consulting firm, and a stock trader, a remarkably successful stock trader. She held up financial disclosure forms. According to your mandatory congressional financial disclosures, which are public record, your joint stock portfolio is currently valued at over $130 million. Let me list your major holdings: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, which is Google's parent company, Meta, formerly Facebook, Nvidia, Disney, Comcast, Visa, Tesla. The portfolio reads like a list of America's most successful technology and media companies, Gabbard observed. Now, there's nothing inherently illegal about owning stocks, but the performance of this portfolio is what raises serious questions in a counterintelligence context. She displayed a chart showing portfolio performance. In 2023, your portfolio returned approximately 54%. For context, the S&P 500, The benchmark index of America's 500 largest companies returned about 25% that year. You didn't just beat the market, Madam Speaker. You more than doubled it. You outperformed professional hedge fund managers with teams of analysts, sophisticated algorithms, and billions in resources. Gabbard pulled out printouts of social media posts. In fact, your stock trading has become so legendary that a social media account called Nancy Pelosi Stock Tracker has gained over 500,000 followers. Individual investors literally track your financial disclosures and copy your trades because your stock picks are so consistently profitable. There are investment websites and forums dedicated to following what's been dubbed the Pelosi portfolio. But you've become a meme in investing circles. Madam Speaker, the politician whose trades are so successful that copying them has become an investment strategy. She set down the documents and looked at Pelosi with the analytical gaze of an intelligence officer. So we're faced with a logical question. There are only two possibilities here. Either your husband, Paul, is the greatest stock picker in Wall Street history, better than Warren Buffett, better than every hedge fund manager with unlimited resources, or he's trading on information that isn't available to the public. My husband doesn't, Pelosi started. Let me ask you directly, Madam Speaker. Gabbard cut in her voice, firm but controlled. As a member of Congress, specifically as Speaker of the House for 4 years, did you receive classified briefings on matters of national security, economic policy, pending regulatory actions, and government contracts? Pelosi hesitated. Members of Congress receive briefings on matters relevant to their duties. Yes or no, please. Did you receive information in your official capacity that was not available to the general public? Information that could move markets if it became known? Yes, but I would never. And you and your husband filed joint tax returns? Correct. You share bank accounts. You jointly own these properties and stocks. When his investments profit, you profit equally. We file jointly, yes, but so you directly benefit from every dollar of profit his trades generate. When he makes $1 million on a stock trade, that's your money too, correct? Pelosi's voice rose slightly. That's a standard legal arrangement for married couples. I'm not questioning the legality of marriage or joint tax returns, Madam Speaker, Gabbard said evenly. I'm establishing that you directly and immediately benefit from your husband's trading activity. You're not separated from it. You're not distant from it. Every dollar he makes enriches you equally. Is that correct? Yes, Pelosi admitted, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. Thank you, Gabbard said, pulling out more documents. Now let's examine specific trades and their timing, because in intelligence work, timing is everything. Suspicious timing transactions that occur right before major market-moving events is one of the clearest indicators of insider information. Let me show you the pattern. She began arranging documents showing a detailed timeline with dates, stock transactions, and corresponding government actions. We're going to look at several cases where the timing of your husband's trades raises serious questions about where the information came from. And I want to be clear, this isn't speculation. These are documented facts, your own mandatory disclosures cross-referenced with public government announcements. The timing speaks for itself. Nancy Pelosi sat motionless in her seat, her face showing the strain of someone who'd walked into an ambush far more sophisticated than she'd anticipated. She'd expected to destroy Gabbard with an accusation of treason. Instead, she was watching a military intelligence officer methodically build a case using the same investigative techniques used to identify security threats. Around the room, members of both parties watched with rapt attention. The accusations of insider trading weren't new, they'd been floating around for years. but never had they been laid out so systematically, so comprehensively with such authority by someone whose credentials made her impossible to dismiss as a partisan hack. Let's start with what I call the NVIDIA fortune, Gabbard said, opening a new section of her folder. And let's see if we can explain the timing through anything other than access to classified information. Tulsi Gabbard pulled out what appeared to be a professionally designed timeline poster, complete with dates, stock prices, government actions, and annotations. She propped it against the document stand, where everyone in the room could see it clearly, cameras zooming in to capture the details. In my role overseeing intelligence operations, Gabbard began, I've learned that isolated suspicious activities might be coincidence, but when you see repeated instances of highly profitable transactions occurring right before major market-moving events, that's a pattern. That's evidence of foreknowledge. That's what we look for when investigating potential security breaches. She pointed to the first section of her timeline. Let's start with Case 1, the NVIDIA fortune. This occurred in June and July of 2022. According to your financial disclosure filed on July 15, 2022, Gabbard held up the official document, Paul Pelosi purchased call options on NVIDIA stock. For those unfamiliar with financial instruments, call options give you the right to buy stock at a set price. They're essentially a bet that the stock will rise significantly. This particular purchase was valued between $1 million and $5 million, according to your disclosure. She moved to the next point on her timeline. Now, at this exact time, Congress was debating the CHIPS and Science Act, a bill that would provide $52 billion in federal subsidies to semiconductor manufacturing companies. As Speaker of the House, you were intimately involved in this legislation. You attended classified briefings about the bill's contents, its likely passage, and its economic impact. Gabbard's voice took on an edge. NVIDIA, Madam Speaker, is one of the largest beneficiaries of semiconductor subsidies. The company designs the advanced chips that would receive massive government support under this legislation. When this bill passed, NVIDIA would benefit enormously. Anyone with advanced knowledge of the bill's passage stood to make a fortune by investing before the public announcement. She pointed to dates on her timeline. Let me establish the sequence clearly. Early July 2022, Paul Pelosi purchases NVIDIA options worth over $1 million. Mid-July 2022, news outlets report on his purchase, causing immediate public controversy and accusations of insider trading. Late July 2022, the House is scheduled to vote on the CHIPS Act. Gabbard pulled out newspaper clippings, printouts of online articles. The timing sparked such intense scrutiny that your office was forced to respond. Let me read from your spokesperson's statement. Speaker Pelosi does not own any stocks and has no prior knowledge or subsequent involvement in any transactions. She looked up at Pelosi. Technically accurate, but deliberately misleading. You don't personally own the stocks your husband does. Very convenient phrasing. But you file joint tax returns. You share accounts. You benefit equally from the profits. Saying you don't own stocks is a legal fiction designed to create distance that doesn't actually exist. But here's what happened next. Gabbard continued, pointing to her timeline again. On July 26, 2022, just days before the House vote on the CHIPS Act, Paul Pelosi suddenly sold all 25,000 NVIDIA shares, completely exited the position. Your spokesperson claimed this was done to avoid any appearance of impropriety. She set down the documents and looked directly at Pelosi. Let's think about that, Madam Speaker. Paul Pelosi sold at a loss of approximately $341,000. He lost money on this trade. Why would he do that if the timing was merely coincidental? If the purchase was just a normal investment decision with no connection to your access to classified information about the CHIPS Act, why sell at a loss? Gabbard pulled out a stock price chart. Here's what makes this even more revealing. After Paul sold those shares after taking a $341,000 loss, to avoid the appearance of impropriety, NVIDIA's stock surged by over 200%. If he'd held those shares, the original stake would be worth over $12 million today. But he sold at a loss. She paused for emphasis. In intelligence analysis, we look for what we call consciousness of guilt. That's behavior that indicates someone knows they've done something wrong. Taking a massive loss to exit a trade right before congressional vote. That's consciousness of guilt. Madam Speaker, you recognize the timing was so suspicious that you were willing to lose $341,000 rather than face the political and potentially legal consequences. What does that tell us? Gabbard asked rhetorically. It tells us that even you acknowledged the trade looked like insider trading. Otherwise, why sell? Why take the loss? The answer is obvious, because the timing was so blatant that continuing the trade would have been indefensible. Pelosi tried to interrupt. We sold to avoid any appearance. Exactly. Gabbard cut her off. You sold to avoid the appearance of what you were actually doing, which was trading on classified information about pending legislation. She moved to the next section of her timeline. Case 2, the visa dump. This is more recent, and in my professional opinion as someone who oversees intelligence operations, even more damning. According to your periodic transaction report, filed in July 2024, Gabbard held up another official document. Paul Pelosi photosold 2,000 shares of Visa stock. Based on Visa's stock price at the time and the disclosure ranges in your filing, this transaction was worth approximately $526,000. Now watch what happens, she said, pointing to her timeline. On September 24, 2024, the Department of Justice filed a major civil antitrust lawsuit against Visa. The lawsuit alleges that Visa illegally monopolized the debit card market, paid competitors to stay out of the market, and engaged in anti-competitive practices that harmed consumers and businesses. This is a massive lawsuit that could fundamentally reshape Visa's business model and profitability. She displayed a stock price chart. When the DOJ lawsuit was announced, Visa's stock immediately dropped 5%. That's billions in market capitalization wiped out in hours. Anyone holding Visa stock suffered immediate losses. Gabbard looked at her timeline. Paul Pelosi sold his Visa stock in July 2024. The lawsuit was announced in September 2024. That's a gap of approximately 2 months, just enough time for the DOJ investigation to be in its final stages, but still confidential, not yet public. She turned to face Pelosi directly. Now, Madam Speaker, let me explain something about how government works. Major antitrust lawsuits don't happen overnight. The Department of Justice spends months investigating building cases, consulting with congressional leaders about the policy implications. As former Speaker and as a senior member of congressional leadership, you attend briefings where these matters are discussed. So my questions are, how did Paul know to sell Visa stock 2 months before a market-moving DOJ announcement? Who told him that a major antitrust lawsuit was coming? Did you attend classified briefings where DOJ investigations into major corporations were discussed? Did you share that information inadvertently or otherwise with your husband? Pelosi's voice was defensive. My spokesperson has already stated that I have no involvement in investment decisions. Your spokesperson says you don't own stocks, Gabbard interrupted, but you file joint tax returns. You benefit from every dollar of profit. When Paul sells Visa stock 2 months before a lawsuit tanks the price, you benefit from avoiding those losses. That's not no involvement. That's complete financial integration with his trading activity. She pulled out more documents. Let me continue because the pattern becomes even clearer with more examples. Case 3. The Microsoft Mystery. In March 2021, Gabbard read from another disclosure, Paul Pelosi purchased Microsoft call options. 12 days later, exactly 12 days, Microsoft was awarded a contract worth $21.88 billion by the United States Army to supply augmented reality headsets to combat troops. This was one of the largest defense contracts awarded that year. Microsoft's stock surged 11% on the news, she noted. Paul Pelosi's options became significantly more valuable. Remarkable timing, wouldn't you say? She didn't wait for an answer. Now, defense contracts of this magnitude don't get decided in 12 days. These contracts are planned, negotiated, and approved over many months. Congressional committees, particularly the Armed Services Committee and Appropriations Subcommittees, are briefed on major defense contracts long before public announcement. As Speaker, you attended these briefings or received detailed summaries. Did Paul's purchase of Microsoft options 12 days before a $22 billion contract announcement involve information you received in classified briefings? Gabbard asked. Because, from an intelligence perspective, the timing is almost impossibly lucky unless someone had advance knowledge. She moved to her next case. Case 4, the Tesla transition. December 2020. Paul Pelosi purchases between $500,000 and $1 million in Tesla stock. 1 month later, in January 2021, President Biden announces that the federal government will transition its entire vehicle fleet to electric vehicles. This includes 225,000 U.S. Postal Service vehicles, one of the largest vehicle procurement programs in government. TES, as a leading electric vehicle manufacturer, would be a major beneficiary of this policy shift, Gabbard noted. And indeed, Tesla's stock price surged following the announcement. Paul Pelosi's December purchase grew substantially in value. She looked at Pelosi. Policy decisions about transitioning the federal fleet to electric vehicles weren't made overnight. They were discussed for months in policy meetings, in White House briefings, in congressional consultations. You were House Speaker at the time. You attended meetings where this was discussed. 1 month before the public announcement, Paul buys Tesla stock. Coincidence? Gabbard stepped back, surveying all the evidence she'd laid out. These aren't isolated incidents, Madam Speaker. This is a pattern spanning years. Purchase right before positive news. Sell right before negative news. Timing that consistently beats professional investors who have teams of analysts and sophisticated market intelligence. She pulled out a statement from a former securities regulator. Let me read from a securities law expert's analysis of your trading patterns. The consistency of well-timed trades, the apparent correlation with non-public government information, and the pattern of profits that exceed professional investors raises serious questions about whether classified or non-public information is being used for personal financial gain. Gabbard looked directly at Pelosi. In my role overseeing intelligence operations, if I saw this pattern from anyone with access to classified information, anyone, I would immediately open a counterintelligence investigation. Because this pattern suggests one of two things: either your husband is receiving non-public information and trading on it, or he's the luckiest investor in American history. So let me ask you directly, Madam Speaker, and I'd like a straight answer. Have you ever shared information you learned in classified congressional briefings with your husband? Have you ever discussed upcoming legislation, pending regulatory actions, or government contract decisions with him before that information was made public? The question hung in the chamber. Every camera focused on Nancy Pelosi. The room fell into complete silence, waiting for her answer. But before she could respond, Gabbard continued. Actually, let me rephrase that question because I realize you might try to hide behind semantics. Let me ask it more specifically. You and your husband live together. You share meals. You discuss your day. When you come home from classified briefings about major legislation or policy changes, do you discuss those matters with him? Pelosi's voice was careful, measured. Congressional rules prohibit sharing classified information. That's not what I asked, Gabbard interrupted. Do you discuss your work with your husband when the CHIPS Act was being negotiated, when major defense contracts were being finalized, when DOJ investigations were ongoing? Did those topics come up in conversation? The silence that followed was damning. Pelosi clearly couldn't claim she never discussed work with her husband. That would be unbelievable. But admitting she discussed sensitive government matters opened the door to accusations that she'd provided the basis for his trading decisions. Your silence is telling, Madam Speaker, Gabbard said quietly, because here's what I think happened. I think you received classified or non-public information in your official capacity. I think you discussed that information with your husband, perhaps not with the explicit intent of helping him trade, but discussed it nonetheless. And I think he used that information to make investment decisions that enriched both of you by tens of millions of dollars. That's not just unethical, Madam Speaker. Depending on the specifics, it could be criminal. It could be securities fraud. It could be honest services fraud. At minimum, it's a violation of the public trust and your oath of office. Gabbard gathered the timeline documents. But we're not done, because your financial irregularities aren't just about stock trading. They're about a broader pattern of living like aristocracy while preaching about inequality. Let's discuss your lifestyle, Madam Speaker. Let's talk about champagne socialism. Tulsi Gabbard pulled out a new section of materials from her folder. These included photographs, social media screenshots, and news article printouts. Her expression shifted from analytical to something closer to contempt. Madam Speaker, she began, in the military we have a concept called leading from the front. It means officers don't ask enlisted soldiers to endure hardships they wouldn't endure themselves. We share the same rations, sleep in the same conditions, face the same dangers. That's how you earn respect and loyalty. She paused. You don't lead from the front. You lead from a $20 million mansion while telling working Americans about sacrifice. Gabbard held up a blown-up photograph showing a gleaming modern kitchen with two massive side-by-side refrigerators. Let's start with this. April 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic is devastating America. Unemployment has spiked to levels not seen since the Great Depression. Small businesses are closing by the thousands. Americans are lining up at food banks in numbers that shocked relief workers. The nation is gripped by fear, uncertainty, and economic catastrophe. She set down the photo. And on April 13, 2020, you appeared on The Late Late Show with James Corden. You gave a video tour of your kitchen in your Pacific Heights mansion, and you showed off your two Sub-Zero refrigerators. Do you know what two Sub-Zero refrigerators cost, Madam Speaker? She didn't wait for an answer. $24,000. $24,000 for refrigerators. While Americans were worried about making rent, while unemployment claims were breaking records, while food banks were overwhelmed, you showed off $24,000 worth of refrigerators on national television. Gabbard displayed another image, a close-up of the refrigerator's interior. And what did you keep in these $24,000 refrigerators? Premium ice cream. You specifically mentioned Genie's Splendid Ice Creams, which costs about $13 per pint. You talked about your collection of gourmet ice cream flavors while millions of Americans were facing food insecurity. Her voice carried controlled anger. The backlash was immediate and severe. Social media exploded with criticism. Even liberal commentators compared it to "let them eat cake," the infamous quote attributed to Marie Antoinette that symbolized aristocratic indifference to suffering. But your office never apologized. You never acknowledged how tone-deaf it appeared. You just moved on insulated in your bubble of wealth and privilege. But that wasn't an isolated incident, Gabbard continued. Let me show you another example of your approach to rules and sacrifice. She displayed security camera footage stills. September 1st, 2020. San Francisco is under strict COVID-19 lockdown orders. Hair salons are closed for indoor services by city mandate. Small salon owners, your constituents, Madam Speaker, are struggling. Some are going out of business entirely. The city you represent is suffering under restrictions that you and other Democratic leaders support. And where are you on September 1st? Gabbard pointed at the image. Inside E-Salon on Union Street in San Francisco, getting your hair blown out. Security footage obtained and published by Fox News shows you walking through the salon without a mask, receiving services that were explicitly prohibited for everyone else under the lockdown orders you supported. She pulled out news articles documenting the controversy. When this footage leaked, you didn't apologize to the small business owners who'd lost their livelihoods following rules you supported. You didn't acknowledge the hypocrisy. You claimed you'd been set up by the salon owner. You blamed the person who exposed your violation rather than taking responsibility for your actions. Gabbard's voice rose slightly. Madam Speaker, I deployed during the pandemic. I served with soldiers who followed strict protocols, who sacrificed time with their families, who did their duty despite hardship. Meanwhile, you got your hair done illegally and then blamed the salon owner for making it public. That's not leadership. That's privilege. She moved to another set of documents. Let's discuss your use of military aircraft. As Speaker of the House, you had access to military transportation for security reasons. That's a legitimate perk of the position. But your specific requests became controversial. Gabbard read from a Judicial Watch report based on Freedom of Information Act requests. Documents show you requested specific luxury military aircraft, including the C-32, basically a military Boeing 757 configured with executive amenities. You requested these aircraft for travel between Washington and San Francisco for trips that could have been accomplished on commercial flights with security details. The Department of Defense estimated the cost to taxpayers for these flights at approximately $2 million per year, she continued. $2 million of taxpayer money for luxury military transportation, while you lectured Americans about carbon emissions and climate change. She looked up from the documents. Madam Speaker, do you know how soldiers typically travel? I can tell you from personal experience. We fly on cargo planes, C-130s with no windows, sitting on nylon netting stretched across the fuselage, sometimes standing for hours because there aren't enough seats. That's how America's warriors travel. You demanded luxury aircraft with comfortable seating, private areas, amenities, on taxpayer money. While soldiers, including soldiers defending the very policies you promote, flew in the back of cargo planes. That's not just hypocrisy. That's contempt for the people who actually serve. Gabbard pulled out photographs of Pelosi's properties. Let's return to your real estate portfolio because it tells a story about your priorities. You own at least 3 luxury residences. Your Pacific Heights mansion worth $10 to $20 million in one of America's most exclusive neighborhoods. Your Napa Valley Vineyard estate worth at least $5 million where you host parties for wealthy donors. She displayed an aerial photograph. This Napa property is particularly revealing. 16 acres, tennis court, swimming pool, buildings for entertaining. Neighbors report that when you're in residence, there are gaggles of black SUVs and helicopter traffic. You host political fundraisers, donor events, gatherings for wealthy supporters. This isn't a modest retreat. This is a compound for cultivating wealthy benefactors. And your Georgetown condominium, Gabbard added, in one of Washington, D.C.'s most expensive neighborhoods, 15 minutes from the capital. Multiple luxury residences, while representing San Francisco, a city with one of the worst homelessness crises in America. She set down the property photos. So let me contrast 2 pictures, Madame Speaker. Here's what I see: you own over $50 million in luxury real estate. You showed off $24,000 refrigerators during a pandemic. You violated lockdown rules to get your hair done while small businesses died. You demanded luxury military aircraft while soldiers flew in cargo planes. You're worth $200 million. And what's your political message? Tax the rich. Address income inequality. The wealthy don't pay their fair share. You position yourself as a champion of working people, a progressive voice for economic justice, a defender of the vulnerable. Gabbard's voice carried undisguised disdain. But, Madam Speaker, you are the rich. You are the inequality. You're in the top 0.01% of Americans by wealth. You live a lifestyle of extraordinary luxury, while your constituents struggle with housing costs, homelessness, and economic insecurity. In the military, we have a term for this, she said. We call it do as I say, not as I do leadership. It doesn't work. Soldiers don't respect officers who demand sacrifice. They won't make themselves. Officers who live in luxury while enlisted troops suffer don't command loyalty. They command contempt. You're a do as I say, not as I do politician, Madam Speaker. You preach about sacrifice while living in palatial comfort. You lecture about inequality while accumulating a fortune. You advocate for rules you don't follow. You represent everything Americans despise about political elites. Gabbard gathered these documents. But there's one more issue we need to address. Because all of this, the unexplained wealth, the insider trading pattern, the luxury lifestyle, the hypocrisy, raises a fundamental question about whether you should still be in Congress at all. Let's talk about age competence and the generational divide you represent. Tulsi Gabbard's tone shifted again, becoming more somber, almost philosophical. She pulled out demographic data, generational analysis charts, and public polling. Madam Speaker, she began carefully, you're 84 years old. You've served in Congress for 37 years, longer than I've been alive. That's an extraordinary career by any measure. But it raises difficult questions that Americans are increasingly asking. When is it time to step aside? When does experience become entrenchment? When does wisdom become decline? She displayed a chart. I want to approach this respectfully because I have genuine concern for you as a person. But the facts are concerning. You've had numerous public moments that suggest cognitive decline, confusion about details, repetitive statements, difficulty following complex discussions. These aren't partisan attacks. They're observable behaviors that worry even members of your own party. Gabbard pulled out news clippings. Multiple Democratic congressional colleagues have privately expressed concerns about your mental acuity. They note meetings where you seem confused, briefings, where you have difficulty tracking information, moments where you appear disoriented. These aren't Republicans attacking you. These are your allies worried about your capacity. She looked at Pelosi with something approaching sympathy. Madam Speaker, there's no shame in aging. Every human faces cognitive changes as they get older. But there is shame in clinging to power when you can no longer effectively serve. There's shame in putting personal prestige above the institution's needs. Let me contrast our situations, Gabbard said. I'm 43 years old. I'm currently deployed, metaphorically speaking, as Director of National Intelligence, overseeing operations, making time-sensitive decisions, managing crises. I maintain my physical fitness standards for the Army Reserve. I stay current on emerging technologies, new threats, changing global dynamics. You're 84, she continued. You've been in Congress since Ronald Reagan was president. The world has changed dramatically. New technologies, new challenges, new generations with different needs. But you remain accumulating wealth, wielding power, blocking younger leaders who might bring fresh perspectives. Gabbard displayed demographic data. Here's what concerns me from a governance perspective. You represent a generation that controls Congress despite being vastly outnumbered by younger Americans. The average age in Congress is 58. You're 26 years older than average. You make decisions about technology you don't understand, about futures you won't live to see, about debt that younger generations will inherit. She pulled out a different chart. Public polling shows that 76% of Americans, including majorities of both parties, believe there should be age limits or term limits for Congress. Americans are tired of watching elderly politicians cling to power while the nation's problems multiply. But this isn't just about age, Gabbard clarified. It's about what your continued presence represents. It's about dynasty politics, about inherited power, about a system that serves insiders rather than citizens. She pulled out Pelosi's family tree. You weren't a self-made politician who rose through merit and service. You were born Nancy Patricia D'Alessandro. Your father, Thomas D'Alessandro Jr., was a U.S. congressman from Maryland who later served as mayor of Baltimore. Your brother, Thomas D'Alessandro III, also served as mayor of Baltimore. You grew up in a household where your father was already a sitting congressman. You were born into political royalty, Gabbard said. You inherited a political network, a fundraising base, name recognition connections. You didn't build these from scratch, they were your birthright. She contrasted this with her own story. I was born in American Samoa to a middle-class family. My father worked in education. We had no political dynasty, no inherited power. When I wanted to serve, I enlisted in the Army after 9/11. I deployed to Iraq at age 23. I earned my combat medical badge under enemy fire. I was elected to Hawaii's state legislature at 21 because I campaigned door-to-door earning votes through work and commitment. Everything I've achieved came through service and merit, Gabbard said. Everything you've achieved came from a system of inherited privilege and accumulated power. We represent two different Americas, one where success comes from service, another where success comes from dynasty. She pulled out electoral data. Your congressional district is one of the safest Democratic seats in America. You've won re-election with 70–80% of the vote for decades. You face no meaningful electoral accountability. Your constituents can't effectively challenge you, even when they disagree with your choices. because the district is so gerrymandered and you have such overwhelming advantages. A safe seat means freedom, Gabbard explained. Freedom to accumulate wealth without voters punishing you. Freedom to make insider trades without electoral consequences. Freedom to live in luxury while constituents struggle without losing your job. You've had that freedom for 37 years. She displayed Pelosi's fundraising totals. You've raised over $400 million for Democratic campaigns during your leadership tenure. That creates loyalty, creates protection. Members of Congress who challenged you found themselves without good committee assignments, without fundraising support, without leadership positions. You built a system where questioning you meant career consequences. That's power, Gabbard said bluntly. Real structural power. The power to make or break political careers. And you've used that power not to serve the American people, but to protect yourself from accountability, to enrich yourself through suspicious stock trades, and to maintain your position despite age and questions about competence. She looked directly at Pelosi. Madam Speaker, you could retire wealthy. You're worth $264 million. You could enjoy your Napa Valley vineyard, your Pacific Heights mansion, your Georgetown condo. You could spend time with family, enjoy the fruits of your career, however you accumulated that wealth. But you won't, because you're addicted to power. You can't let go. That addiction hurts America, Gabbard said. It blocks younger leaders who might bring new ideas. It perpetuates a system where elderly politicians make decisions they won't live with the consequences of. It represents everything that's broken about American politics: dynasty, privilege, insider, enrichment, power, addiction, generational capture. She gathered her documents. In the military, we have a philosophy: train the next generation, then step aside. Great leaders know when their time has passed. They mentor successors. They pass the torch, they serve, and move on. They don't cling to rank until death or disability forces them out. You've forgotten that, Gabbard said, if you ever knew it. You represent a political class that views public office as personal property, that refuses to acknowledge limits, that serves themselves rather than the nation. That's why I left the Democratic Party, Madam Speaker. Not because of policy disagreements, but because the party was controlled by people like you, wealthy insiders, who enriched themselves while preaching about the people. She closed this section of her folder. But we need to summarize, because I've presented a comprehensive case over the past several hours. Let me bring this to a conclusion with what I call the Lieutenant Colonel's verdict. Tulsi Gabbard stood gathering all her materials, organizing them into neat stacks that visually represented the comprehensive case she'd built. The hearing had been going for nearly 4 hours. No one had left the chamber. Cable news networks had stayed with the coverage throughout, recognizing they were witnessing something historic. Let me summarize what we've documented here today. Gabbard began her voice carrying the authority of a military officer delivering a final briefing. Using the same analytical standards I employ in my role overseeing intelligence operations, I've presented evidence that should concern every American, regardless of party affiliation. She held up the first stack of papers. Financial irregularity. You've accumulated $200 billion in wealth on a congressional salary of $223,500 per year. Your total congressional compensation over 37 years is approximately $8.3 million. Yet, you're worth $264 million. That's a discrepancy of $257 million that cannot be explained by your documented income. Another stack. Suspicious trading patterns. multiple documented instances of stock purchases immediately before positive market-moving events, and sales immediately before negative events. Your husband bought NVIDIA options before the CHIPS Act vote. He sold Visa before the DOJ lawsuit. He bought Microsoft before a $22 billion defense contract. He bought Tesla before the EV mandate announcement. The timing in each case suggests access to non-public information. Another stack. Pattern of performance. Your portfolio consistently outperforms professional investors' hedge funds with unlimited resources and market benchmarks. In 2023 alone, your return was 54% versus 25% for the S&P 500. This level of consistent outperformance is statistically unlikely without some informational advantage. She continued methodically. Consciousness of guilt. When the NVIDIA trade became public and sparked controversy, Paul Pelosi immediately sold at a $341,000 loss to avoid the appearance of impropriety. This action demonstrates awareness that the trading pattern appeared suspicious, even illegal. Innocent investors don't take massive losses to avoid appearances. Lifestyle hypocrisy. You own over $50 million in luxury real estate. You showed off $24,000 refrigerators during a pandemic. You violated lockdown rules for personal convenience while small businesses died. You demanded luxury military aircraft while soldiers flew in cargo planes. You preach about inequality while living in the top 0.001%. Generational entrenchment. At 84 years old, after 37 years in Congress, you continue clinging to power despite concerns about cognitive decline, despite being out of touch with younger generations, despite blocking new leaders from rising. You represent everything wrong with a gerontocracy that serves itself rather than the nation. Gabbard set down all the stacks, creating a visual representation of the comprehensive case. This isn't partisan politics, Madam Speaker. This is documented evidence of patterns that, in an intelligence context, would trigger immediate investigation into potential compromise, corruption, or security threats. She looked directly at Pelosi. You called me a Russian asset. You questioned my loyalty to America. You tried to have me removed from this hearing by attacking my credibility and patriotism. So let me respond to those accusations by telling you what I've actually done for this country. Her voice took on intensity. I enlisted in the United States Army after the attacks of September 11, 2001. I was 22 years old. I voluntarily deployed to Iraq in 2004, leaving my position in Hawaii's state legislature to serve in a combat zone. I served with a field medical unit at Logistical Support Area Anaconda, one of the most attacked bases in Iraq. I was there when mortars fell. I was there when casualties came in. I earned the Combat Medical Badge for participating in combat operations under enemy hostile fire. That's not a political position or a policy disagreement, Gabbard said, her voice rising. That's putting your life on the line for your country. That's service. That's sacrifice. That's what patriotism actually looks like. She continued, emotion breaking through her military discipline. I deployed again to Kuwait in 2008-2009. I led a platoon as a military police officer. I trained Kuwaiti counterterrorism teams. I've served over 2 decades in uniform. I'm currently a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve. I've spent significant portions of my adult life in service to this nation, often at personal cost. What have you sacrificed, Madam Speaker? Gabbard demanded. What have you risked? You've gotten wealthy, $200 million wealthy. You've lived in extraordinary luxury. You've wielded enormous power. You've never worn the uniform. You've never deployed to a combat zone. You've never put yourself in harm's way for your country. You've never missed your child's birthday because you were stationed overseas. You've never wondered if you'd make it home. Her voice dropped, but carried even more force. Yet you have the absolute audacity, to call me a Russian asset, to question my patriotism, to suggest I'm a traitor. Let me be absolutely clear. Gabbard said, her words measured and deliberate. I have bled for this country. I have served under fire. I have earned my place through merit, through service, through sacrifice. I've been vetted by the FBI, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and confirmed by the United States Senate to serve as Director of National Intelligence. You've gotten rich while in office, she continued. You've traded stocks based on classified information. You've lived in luxury while preaching about equality. You've clung to power well past the point of effectiveness. You represent dynasty politics and inherited privilege, and you question my loyalty. Gabbard's voice carried unmistakable contempt. I'm not afraid of your accusations, Madam Speaker. I've faced actual enemies, people with actual weapons who actually wanted to kill me. Your political attacks don't frighten me. Your attempts to destroy my credibility don't concern me. Because I have something you don't have and can't buy, I have the moral authority of someone who actually served their country with honor. She gathered her materials. I'm calling on this committee to take the following actions. First, refer this matter to the Securities and Exchange Commission for a full investigation into potential insider trading. The patterns I've documented meet every standard for suspicious activity. And second, refer this matter to the House Ethics Committee for a comprehensive investigation into wealth accumulation while in office. Americans deserve to know how a member of Congress accumulates $200 million on a government salary. Third, pass legislation immediately banning members of Congress and their immediate families from trading individual stocks. Senator Hawley's Pelosi Act would be appropriate. Members should be limited to broad-based index funds. If you want to serve the public, not your investment portfolio. Fourth, strengthen enforcement of existing laws. Make penalties meaningful. Make reporting real-time. Make violations career-ending, not just a minor fine. Fifth, have a serious national conversation about age limits, term limits, and generational change in Congress. Americans are tired of watching elderly politicians cling to power while the nation's problems multiply. Chairman Turner nodded slowly. Thank you, Director Gabbard. Your recommendations will be considered. Madam Speaker Pelosi, you have the opportunity to respond to the testimony and evidence presented. The room fell silent. Every camera focused on Nancy Pelosi. She sat rigid in her seat, her hands gripping the table's edge. The confident political operator who'd entered the hearing to destroy a critic now looked diminished, defensive, aged. She leaned toward her microphone, her voice lacking the commanding presence she'd displayed hours earlier. These are partisan attacks designed to distract from the important work of Congress. My financial disclosures are public record. Everything I've done is legal. Legal and ethical are not the same thing. Gabbard interrupted, her voice cutting and final. You've operated within technical legal boundaries while violating every ethical standard that should govern public service. You've enriched yourself through access to classified information. You've lived in luxury while preaching equality. You've clung to power despite age and decline. And when someone with actual credentials challenges you, you attack their patriotism. I don't respect your authority anymore, Madam Speaker, Gabbard said bluntly. You had authority once you were Speaker of the House, a powerful position. But you lost that position because Democrats lost the House, partly because Americans are tired of politicians like you. Now you're just another aging member of Congress who refuses to step aside. I have authority, Gabbard continued. I'm the Director of National Intelligence, confirmed by the Senate overseeing the nation's intelligence operations. I'm a lieutenant colonel who's actually served this country in combat. I have the authority that comes from service, from sacrifice, from merit. You have the remnants of power you're desperately trying to hold on to. She stood gathering her folders. This hearing is over for me. I've presented the evidence. I've made my recommendations. I've said what needed to be said. The American people can judge for themselves who serves this nation and who serves themselves. As Gabbard prepared to leave the witness table, something unprecedented happened. Several Republican committee members began to applaud. Then some Democrats joined quietly, almost reluctantly, but joining nonetheless. Even some Democrats couldn't continue defending the indefensible after watching a combat veteran methodically dismantle a career politician's credibility using nothing but documented evidence. Nancy Pelosi sat alone at her position on the dais, the powerful political force who'd commanded respect and fear for decades now looking isolated and exposed. The cameras captured it all, the contrast between the young combat veteran walking away with her head high and the elderly career politician left to face the consequences of decades of self-enrichment. The hearing would be viewed over 400 million times within 48 hours, but its impact would extend far beyond viral clips and social media posts. This was the moment when a combat veteran forced a national conversation about corruption, about insider trading, about elderly politicians enriching themselves while Americans struggled. And it all happened because Nancy Pelosi made one catastrophic mistake. She attacked the patriotism and credibility of someone who'd actually earned both through service under fire.